So you've all been made aware that the recording is in progress. Just as a reminder, the things that we talk about here, excuse me, are for Legends of Real Estate. If someone finds this video someplace in life in general, that any discussions here are strictly for the Legends of Real Estate, and we respect the antitrust rules and regulations, so please keep that in mind. Amongst us, our conversation is open and open. It can be open. How about that? Let me. For those online, I will try to watch to see that if you have a hand up. If I miss a question, please just yell out. Don't have the chat box open. I just have the window open. So this isn't the August business meeting, but I did want to talk about the compensation agreement. So before we start talking about the compensation agreement, or as we start talking about the compensation agreement, I want to kind of just remind us that compensation is, one, always negotiable. Two, it's the compensation that you establish as a listing agent is the compensation between the seller and the listing brokerage, us. Concessions are different, compensation is different, and commission is different. So I want to make sure that we just refreshed our memories on the differences in all three of those. Commission has always been, or in most cases has been referred to as compensation or payment based on a percentage of the sales price. And I think that what we really need to do is move the word commission aside and focus on compensation. And especially when we're talking to sellers and buyers, we have to talk about the differences between compensation and concessions. And when we're talking about compensation, we're really talking about a monetary amount. This can be expressed as a percentage. It can be expressed as a flat fee. This is solely compensation, what you are paid for what you do. Again, huge emphasis on value. It's the discussion of value, which we haven't had to have as often with buyers, needs to be more present and relevant in our communication with our buyers at this point. So we're working on setting up, some of you had picked up a copy of the buyer agreement, or excuse me, the buyer consult that we had started to put together. I'll be reaching out to find out if any of you have feedback so that we can improve that and finalize it so that there's something for you to use in your buyer consult, a guide if nothing else. But compensation really needs to be discussed with both buyers and sellers. Concessions are those items that are negotiated. And this would be closing costs. This would be repairs. This would be in lieu of type of items. Does not relate to compensation. Concessions and compensation remain completely separate and should remain completely separate. So that's going to be tough for us because we've often said, oh, a certain amount towards buyer's closing costs, or the seller would be willing to give a certain amount. Those are concessions as long as they're relatable to specific costs. And then people say, well, but if it's a specific cost, why isn't it compensation? Why can't the seller pay compensation for the buyer? The seller can pay compensation to the buyer's brokerage on behalf of the buyer, or is on behalf of the buyer, but it has to still be kept separate from concessions or monetary allowances for specific prepaids, closing costs, down payment, rate reduction, that kind of a thing. So it has to be kept completely separate in compensation and concessions. So we're going to focus on compensation and concessions as we have our discussions as it relates to our listing agreements, our buyer agreements, making sure that they're all kept separate and understood what they are. So what can you say in MLS? This is just a refresher. I know that many of you have already seen this, and that's great, but I do want to, we are having some challenges with not only internally, we were very fortunate. We only had one item that popped at the, after the August 17, even no matter how many times we looked at them, we still had one, which was fine because MLS was great for the last couple of weeks of August, really didn't levy the fine. just ask for a change and ask for rationale as to how that got in there and what the intent was. Now, if you can believe this, and this is, funny story, not so funny, but since I sit on the board, we had our board meeting last week, and the COO, Kimberly Wiggins, probably many of you have either talked to her or know who she is. An agent put into MLS that the seller was willing to offer 3 bananas to the buyer's brokerage. And so Kimberly called the agent and said,
no
this
bananas today.
yeah, this is still inappropriate. And the agent actually argued with her and said, no, I was told in one of the videos that I could use bananas. And Kimberly said, I think what you're referring to is that the video discussed bananas in lieu of discussing compensation because of antitrust. You need to remove your 3 bananas. She called back twice and argued with her on her ability to use bananas. So,
That's funny.
No bananas.
no bananas, no apples, no oranges.
Yes, we have no
Bananas
Today, right. So what you can and can't say, just as a reminder, please avoid things like cooperative, willing to cooperate with buyer's broker, cooperation, that kind of thing is not a bonus, a reward. Be careful of bonus and reward. Those are compensation related words. It's a bonus to the buyer's broker or a reward to the buyer's broker. Anything related back to the buyer's broker is considered compensation, can't be stated in MLS.
So how do you handle bonuses if a seller would give a bonus?
Concessions.
A concession, also
Concession.
concessions.
Mhm.
Okay.
$1,000 concession towards can't even say that.
Close before the end of the month.
Right.
It is tough how to do it.
Can't. Has to be in the compensation agreement.
But you can't use the words either.
No, so you can't say $1,000 bonus to buyer's broker.
You can't just say bonus.
No.
Nothing.
No, what's popping right now is a lot of bonus rooms, but of course MLS reviews that and says this is a bonus room. This is not related to compensation. But anything related to compensation will be flagged, and it's an immediate $1,000 fine. If you don't fix it in 24 hours, another $1,000 fine to the brokerage.
And you.
Still do no bonuses.
Yeah, so anything that's going to relate to that, it should be identified as a concession. $10,000 concession or $10,000 concessions to buyer. It's all to the buyer. That's what the DOJ has been so adamant about, is the decoupling of everything. Everything has to go buyer to seller, seller to buyer, buyer to seller, seller to buyer. So anything that would be in MLS that reflects compensation in any way is invalid.
Don't.
Has to be a concession.
Don't do it, right. Incent or incentivize or incentives, out. Those words be flagged and tagged.
But so you can put all 3 concessions.
Sure, because the concessions are to the buyer, not to the brokerage.
To the brokerage.
So
Oh, that's right.
Seller
That's
is
right.
offering $10,000 concessions to buyer,
Right.
and the buyer can use it however they want. Well, we don't know. I mean,
Right, whatever.
if the seller is offering concessions, the concessions can be for anything,
Mhm.
anything tangible other than compensation. Compensation and concessions must remain separate.
So the buyer can use that towards his payment of concessions, but you can't state that
Payment of compensation?
of compensation, or no?
No,
Okay.
the buyer still, if the agreement is that the seller is paying $10,000 concessions,
Mhm.
and the
Buyer can use
$10,000
it on
concession
whatever.
can use it on whatever, but the buyer still has a compensation charge on the closing statement.
Right, but he can pay that just towards closing period, right? The 10,000.
The sellers? Yes, yes,
So
however,
it would cover it, but it's not stated that it covers it, basically.
right, so the seller can offer concessions. If the amount of concessions exceeds what the buyer needs, and the buyer would now like to use that towards their compensation, as long as the seller agrees that the buyer is paying compensation, or that the seller's monies are going towards compensation, then it's fine. As long as it's written and signed and agreed to by all parties,
Okay.
right? So that's really the only way, is if it exceeds what they need. But this is exactly why we have the compensation agreement, is because the buyer can then request assistance in the buyer brokerage compensation. Buyer broker, anything that says buyer broker in MLS, don't put anything in there, buyer broker. Seller will work with buyer broker, out. Don't. Seller, no, has nothing to do with seller, nope, out. $1,000 bonus to buyer rep, out. Anything related to the buyer rep, the buyer's brokerage, out. Concession terms you can use, buyer closing costs, money towards buyer's closing costs, concessions towards buyer closing costs. We can use lender fees, seller willing to cover lender fees, in other words, rate buy downs or something like that. Repairs, $5,000 towards buyer's repairs. Renovations, improvements, carpet, kitchen update, fine, no problem. New roof, $10,000 towards new roof, $20,000 towards new roof. Any of those, seller offering $5,000 towards buyer closing costs. And this can be in the public or the private remarks.
Motivated
Either one.
seller?
Excuse me?
Motivated seller, where would that come in?
Motivated, so.
Motivated seller?
Yeah.
You can put that in there. You can put that in public or private remarks.
Okay, so
Yeah.
would that,
Motivated seller will work.
would that imply that possibly that is compensation?
No,
Yes.
they're just saying that they're a motivated seller, so you're fine there.
Okay.
There's nothing
okay.
related to compensation or concessions in that.
Be a price for whatever.
Well, and then the buyer,
Time.
Sure.
Could be anything.
and Holly just said that could be time, and that's exactly where we want to go with compensation. Compensation now needs to be considered a term or condition of the offer and contract. So compensation is negotiated just like the time for closing is negotiated. Compensation is negotiated just like the type of lending is negotiated. Compensation is negotiated just like
New roof or a new.
repairs are negotiated, just like any of that. So absolutely, that's exactly how we have to look at it. We have to look at it completely separate, and we have to look at it just as another term or condition. 2.5% concessions to buyer, that's fine. And that one
You
kind of
can
struck
put
me,
that
that
in
you
there?
can put a percentage or a dollar amount as concessions to the
buyer.
buyer,
But that's not compensation.
not compensation.
The buyer can use that for whatever, he can use it to pay his car payment or whatever he wants to do with it, as long as he's,
Yeah, well, no, it would have to be on the closing statement.
oh, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
He could use it towards a kitchen, outdoor kitchen or really kind
It
of.
could use it
repairs or
towards
anything.
repairs, down payment, closing costs, points. No. No compensation.
Concessions is the word to use.
Right, so not towards compensation. It's
You
concession.
can't concession towards compensation, you just do
Right, the
concessions.
buyer
in lieu
can
of,
use his
yeah.
concession.
In lieu of. It's really in lieu of, if you needed to use it that way,
In lieu of,
compensation.
no,
Mhm.
no. So it's 2.5% concessions to buyer. Those concessions are towards closing costs, down payment, any of that,
Assistance. is what
not
they're towards.
compensation.
I understand what you're saying, but I'm going around the back door as part of negotiations with compensation at some point in there to give that instead of other.
Yeah.
But it would have to come from the seller.
Exactly.
So that's what the compensation agreement does. So if during negotiation, the seller reduces their 2.5% concessions, and offers the buyer's broker $5,000, they can do that. Executed in a compensation agreement.
It's different.
It is different. Did I miss any questions out there? Anything anybody wants to add from out there? In La La Land?
No.
All right. So what we're really talking about is knowing what the seller intends to pay. And that's what we have to keep reminding ourselves is everything that we're doing is what the seller intends to pay. This is not, nothing is written in stone until it becomes a contract. So this is, I think, where we're having some confusion about these compensation agreements. The compensation agreements are used in a couple of different ways. So let's talk about that. There is the seller's broker to buyer's broker. Seller's broker to buyer's broker. For those of us who've been doing this for more than a week and a half, that is the way that it used to be done.
So that's out.
It's not out. The seller's broker can still pay the buyer's broker if the seller indicates, or if the policy of the brokerage is that the money flows through the brokerage.
Which is what we were recommending.
No.
Okay.
No, we're recommending the other. We'll talk about why that is. So the seller's broker to buyer's broker, if you're taking a listing today and the seller says, look, I don't really care. I just don't want to pay more than 6%. Then you say, great, my fee is 3%, which tells us, or you could say my fee is 3.5%. Therefore, Mr. Ms. Seller, are you comfortable offering the buyer's broker 2.5%? Yes. No. I want to negotiate with you. I don't think you should get more. No, you're not doing everything you should. Okay, no, I don't want you. I want you should have 2.75 and they should have 3.25 because they're bringing the buyer and I want to incentivize them to bring the buyer. I don't know. That's part of what your negotiation is.
Right.
We're setting a standard for you. They can negotiate. The sellers can negotiate with you. You know what the parameters are.
Sell yourself at that point.
Well, just like we always have with our
Yeah.
listings. Yeah,
That's where you
absolutely.
have to sell yourself.
Yeah. So you have that discussion with your sellers and then you codify that in the listing agreement. And our policy will be that the money flows through the seller. So we'll be focused on the other one. But in this case, if the seller said, and I'm paying you everything, and you say, that's right, I'm taking everything, then it's seller's broker to buyer's broker.
Right.
Right. So if I'm taking everything, the brokerage is taking everything. So this is, again, this form, the compensation agreement, the seller's broker to buyer's broker, this confirms the seller's intent when compensation flows through the seller's broker. I, the seller, am paying my listing brokerage all the money, and they will pay the buyer's brokerage. Right? That's how it's going to work. And if you are showing property or have been showing property, and one of the properties that you're showing has been on the market more than 30 days, the listing agreement was probably created in this format. Which means that if you call, there's no obligation to call, but if you call the seller's agent, the listing agent, and say, hi, is the seller offering compensation? And the listing agent says, yes. And you say, will you please send me the compensation agreement reflecting that? And they say, I'm on the road, I can't do that right now, I'll text you the amount. That's fine, that's fine. If you forget to ask, is the money flowing through the seller or through the brokerage? Then I would probably just make your offer and include the seller's broker to buyer's broker compensation agreement. It would be the seller's responsibility to modify that or change that to the appropriate flow of monies. keep going. Yep.
Question, so if I get a call, I'm a listing agent, I get a call from the buyer's agent and says, are you doing compensation? And I say, yes. She'll say, what? I say, 2.5%. Do I have anything in writing other than what I have in my listing agreement?
You should have, we've included the compensation agreements in all the listing packets. We recommend that you fill out the compensation agreement at the time of listing without the seller's signatures. You don't have to have the seller signatures because this is the intent
Okay,
of the seller at the time.
Okay.
And you fill it out at the time of listing, whichever is appropriate, and we will be shifting towards the seller to buyer brokerage.
and what is that form called?
That form is the compensation agreement that we're reviewing here. These are the forms that you would fill out at the time of listing
Okay,
to indicate the seller's intent at the time of listing as to what they will compensate.
but this has a lot of things for the buyer, the buyer's broker compensation.
Leave it blank.
So you're filling out only those pieces that are
To that,
to that. See, because this is, okay, so how about this? Let's finish the
Yes.
two,
Mhm.
because some of the discussion is appropriate for
Okay.
either form.
Okay.
So let's make sure that we're clear on it. It's really just how the money flows, and
Okay.
it's seller's broker to buyer's broker. Did I miss anybody online? A question? Did I miss?
Not yet.
Seller's broker to buyer's broker versus seller to buyer's broker.
Right.
And so anyway, this is the requesting compensation from the seller's broker that has been shared, right? So, and this are properties that were in MLS prior to really August 17th will probably be using this unless the brokerage has required that the listing agent modify or update the listing agreement to the current NEFAR, or excuse me, Florida Realtor listing agreement, right? So you don't know. If you're working with the buyer, you don't know what the seller and listing brokerage have agreed to, nor should you, right? Because part of all of this agreement is that the buyer works with the buyer's agent and the seller works with the seller's agent. So there's not a need to know. But if your buyer has requested, then you want to ask, then you want to share or know. And then the way to solidify that is through this agreement here,
Yes, and David.
right? So
Yeah.
the other option is the seller to buyer's broker. Notice it's seller to buyer's broker instead of seller's broker to buyer's broker. And with this one, this is just confirming the seller's intent and that the money will flow through the seller. And this is requesting compensation. You would also use this in requesting compensation in addition to the original seller's intent when the seller's broker is paying the buyer's broker. That's the one that kind of, that can get confusing to people, is if you have a buyer that's interested in a property that was listed either before August 17, where the money flows through the seller's brokerage, or a listing that was taken where the money flows through the seller's broker, and the buyer has agreed with you as their agent to pay 3%, but you have found out that the seller is paying 2.5% through the seller's brokerage, and the buyer would like the seller to pay the additional 0.5%, you would have to use both forms. You'd have to use the seller's broker to buyer's broker for the 2.5% that the seller has already committed or has expressed the intention to pay, and an additional 0.5% on the seller to buyer's broker for the 0.5% additional monies that the buyer is now requesting of the seller. Karen.
Hold on, okay, I didn't get that.
Okay, run it one more time.
Yeah, one more
Yeah,
time.
I did not get that. I would have to have you say that again. But here's my initial question before you do explain that again.
Sure.
Is this all specific to August 17th? The difference between having the seller's broker receive the compensation or the seller compensating the buyer's broker directly? I mean, is it all
is
a function of the 17th, or what, why would they decide to go directly to the buyer's broker rather than just go like we always have, the seller's broker to the buyer's broker?
Okay, so there's a lot packed into that. So the Department of Justice, the reason that a lot of this has flown through is that the Department of Justice felt, and the case that came that was settled felt, that by having money flow solely through a listing brokerage, neither the buyer nor the seller was being given the opportunity to negotiate. And that therefore we as real estate professionals were setting standards as to what the compensation was that was being paid. So the part of what came out of, so the case went through, the jury found National Association of Realtors and everybody else guilty. In order to avoid the $4.6 billion amount, NAR worked with the attorneys and the Department of Justice to come up with a $418 million settlement amount and certain criteria. One of the criteria is that there must be greater transparency, so that the seller and the buyer have to be aware of how money is flowing. Now, I'm going to do a little sidebar here. Sidebar, Clark's opinion. This is all funny money because it looks the same on the closing disclosure. However, the paperwork to get there looks different.
Right.
It's the paperwork that looks different to establish a level of transparency. And the big word that was used, and I think it's a hyphenated word, so we'll say it's one word, the decoupling of compensation,
Right.
which is a seller pays a seller's representative and a buyer pays a buyer's representative.
Right.
So to your question of was it all August 17? No. August 17 began the tick date of when we needed to be more aware. Any property that was on the market prior to August 17th, the brokerage was probably using a listing agreement that indicated that the seller would pay the money to the listing brokerage and that the listing brokerage would pay the buyer brokerage. Does that relationship, or did that relationship go away after August 17th? No, it did not. A seller can still pay a listing brokerage all the apples, all the bananas, all the dollars. They can pay all of them to the one listing brokerage, and then the listing brokerage pays the buyer's brokerage.
And since
Or,
sorry.
you go, since we.
Well, since we are establishing our value, it seems like that is the way to present ourselves, because we handle so much for them. And that is why we earn our compensation. And it's not really us. I mean, it is, because the Legends is sharing is the passing the money along, but it's really just the HUD or the Alta that's doing it. In addition to that question, which thank you for the example and the background, but if an agent calls me about a listing, is your seller willing to work with a buyer's agent? I feel like the best response, if the seller has said this, well, yes, but I want to pay the least amount I can. All right. So is yes, my seller is willing to negotiate the buyer's commission. All commission is negotiable until the closing. So present an offer. It doesn't it all get washed in the negotiations anyway? I mean, can't we just
No.
all blanketly say, yes, the seller is willing to negotiate, because it might be a 0.
Right. It might be a 0, let's,
I've got the 0.
you've got the 0. Okay. So, and you're not alone. So, so Karen, I understand what you're saying, but, and can't we just do it the way that we used to? Yes, we can, unless the brokerage sets a different policy. And we are leaning to the policy of that the seller pays the buyer's broker. The reason being is currently, before August 17th, MLS, one of the pieces of MLS, one of the many benefits of MLS was cooperation and compensation. So when you saw the compensation that was being offered in MLS, it was a guarantee that your brokerage would be paid that amount.
Right.
Unless something came up during it and the brokerages agreed to alter that. Let's just stick with the basics. That was a guarantee of compensation. That doesn't exist anymore. The guarantee of cooperation exists anymore. It exists now, but not the compensation. And that was part of the impetus of this, is that we needed to break the compensation out. So I agree with you that we have to, as agents, be more clear with our sellers as what our value is. And as agents working with buyers, we're going to have to do the same thing. The compensation, the brokerages set guidelines to listing brokerage compensation. So you already know what you can negotiate and the ramifications of any change to that negotiation with your seller. And that's where we're going to have to focus, is what are we doing for you? What am I doing for you? This is the value I believe that I bring, and therefore I charge this amount with the seller. The compensation, the conversation has to then be separated out and say, now, Mr. Seller, Ms. Seller, Ms., Mr., whomever you are you interested in incentivizing? Are you interested in offering? Are you interested in working with a buyer's broker? And most sellers are going to say, yes, absolutely, I'll work with a buyer's broker. Well, to what level will you be willing to work with a buyer's broker? Many sellers are going to say, I don't know. What do you think? What do you think is fair? And you have to be able to say, well,
In the past.
in the past, in my experience, I would believe that offering compensation or having the intent to offer compensation to the buyer's broker at 2%, 2.5%, 3% would be fair in this market. And the seller can say, I don't want to do that. I only want to offer 1. That's fine. You can do that. I only want to offer 0. And we have many sellers saying that, look, I don't want to offer compensation to the buyer's broker. Let them bring me an offer. Let them ask for what they want to ask for, and I'll evaluate it, the compensation, along with the other terms and conditions that they make in their offer. Does that make sense, Karen?
Absolutely. And that's how I'm seeing it play out. I did hear from Berkshire Hathaway agent who said that they've been encouraged strongly to verify and mandate that their sellers cooperate with buyers, so that, in other words, they're doing the same thing we've always done. I don't know what they do if a seller says no.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Let me just.
I know I'm not allowed
to say
that.
Not that they aren't always, but they're encouraging their sellers to work with buyers. We don't know that, or with buyers brokerages. We don't know that means the money is flowing through that brokerage or that the money is flowing from the seller to the buyer's broker. We won't know that until we have a
Right.
discussion with them or submit an offer on their property. But so we don't know that they're doing it like they used to. So, and because there is no like they used to. So the only way that it's not going to be seller's broker to buyer's broker is if the brokerage has set up a policy to work seller to buyer's broker, or that the listing was taken before August 17th and the listing agreement was not altered or re-executed on the new listing form that offers them the opportunity to go seller to buyer's broker.
I think what I was trying to say is that the sellers under listing agents with Berkshire apparently do not have the option of 0. Or if they do, they don't relist.
Okay, that would be illegal. They can't do that.
Okay, I didn't say that then.
You, you were just recounting your observations of a story that was told to you. So it's not a big deal at all. But you bring up an excellent point. Can we say to our sellers, you must? No, we cannot.
That's what you can say though. Can't you say that the other agent, the buyer's agent, is working the same as the seller's agent, and not anybody works for nothing?
Well, the buyer
No.
gets paid by the buyers, the buyer gets paid by the buyer's agent,
The buyer's agent gets paid by the buyer.
right?
Yeah. So to Christie's point, can't you say to a seller,
It's more lucrative to you to get more people to show your property if you're offering to help incentives towards the buyers.
I
Can
don't
you say
think
that?
you can say that you can. What we can say is that we believe that when a seller offers compensation to a buyer's broker, that the opportunity for showings increase. We don't know that for
Right.
sure. We honestly don't know that. We
Right.
don't know because we're just starting to break apart those compensations. So we don't know that a 0 is going to bring less traffic. And we can't assume that because of the second piece of the settlement, which is every buyer before seeing a house must sign a buyer brokerage agreement indicating that they will pay.
Mhm.
This is why there's no obligation for a buyer's agent to contact a listing agent about compensation. And it's the same reason we have a complaint filed in Tallahassee or in Tallahassee for steering because an agent refused to show a home where the seller wasn't offering compensation. This brings up that discussion of, well, can't a buyer say, don't show me a house that doesn't offer compensation? They can, but we still have to present all homes to them.
Right.
So we have to present all homes and we have to be able to prove that we presented all homes and that they then chose not to see a house because they've made a commitment to us through the buyer brokerage agreement saying they will pay us. So it shouldn't matter what the seller is offering. Now, and the other part of it is when they write their offer, they have the right to ask for whatever they want, concessions and compensation.
So they can ask for compensation.
Buyer.
The buyer can ask the seller to compensate their buyer's broker, but you still have to keep concessions and compensations separate.
Mhm.
So they have to ask for concessions for one thing and compensation for another, right? So Maggie had her hand up, and before I run through the example again, I wanted to check with Maggie to see if, before I run through that example, if she's okay.
No, I'm not okay. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, I am okay. To go back to what was said, I think it was Karen. Yeah, before Karen had her
Yeah.
question. So the 2-form thing, right? Like, I just want to make sure I've got it. So if the seller is going to pay 2.5% commission to the buyer's brokerage, but the buyer and the buyer's agent or broker, right? They sign something for 3%, that's when you would need both forms, right?
If the buyer is requesting that additional 0.5% compensation and is unwilling to currently pay it.
You have to give them
Both.
the opportunity
Okay,
to
Ed,
match.
No, no, you don't have to give anybody the opportunity to match.
So then what's that for?
Which form?
Modification. So it's right there.
Okay, so the modification, so let me make sure that we're answering the question that was on the table. When do I have to use both forms? If the buyer and the buyer's brokerage has signed a buyer agency agreement at 3%, and the buyer is now making an offer on a home, and we've called and said we're writing an offer, is the seller offering compensation? They say, yes, the seller is offering compensation. And then we say, well, what was the seller's intent? And the listing agent says the seller's intent is 2.5%, right? Now we know the seller's intent. If it's seller's broker to buyer's broker, so if the seller, the listing agent has said, the seller is paying us and we're paying you, or the listing agent has said, use the seller's broker to buyer's broker agreement. They've said that. 2.5%. They sent it over to you. They said, here's what the seller's intentions are right now. 2.5%. They sent that seller's broker to buyer's broker with you. And now you're putting the offer together and the buyer says, look, they'll cover 2.5%. The buyer's brokerage agreement says you're going to credit me whatever they give me, whatever they pay gets credited to what I owe. Great. I still don't want to pay the other 0.5%. Like, okay, great. So part of your offer then is we'll accept your 2.5% that comes through the brokerages, but now I want you, seller, to pay an additional 0.5%. That would be using the seller to buyer's broker form to cover the 0.5%. So now both forms go with your offer over to the seller. Now, the seller says, look, I'll pay the extra 0.5%, but I'm just going to pay it through the seller's brokerage. They would then modify the seller to buyer brokerage to 0 and modify the seller's broker to buyer's broker to 3%. And the listing agent would have to modify the listing agreement to reflect the increase in compensation.
Paperwork.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay.
I have
Maggie
one more
and-
question. Can I ask a question about that?
Absolutely.
So you had the seller modify the listing agreement for the offer that was just presented, but that was based on an amount that might be different if that were to fall through than another offer that would come in. But now they've signed a listing agreement for 3% because that's what the previous offer had negotiated. Why are you modifying a listing agreement when it's really just an offer that got negotiated?
Good point.
Well, if then you can modify it back.
You modify
So if it didn't go through, I'm sorry, I made the assumption that when the seller countered the buyer's offer and agreed to the 3%, that they were agreeing that they were going under contract.
Okay,
The only way, excuse me?
no, that explained it. Thank you.
Because the only way for the listing brokerage to receive the entire amount is to modify the listing agreement to reflect a change in agreement between the seller and the buyer's broker. Just like the modification to anything, you could modify the listing agreement to state that the seller will now pay the listing brokerage 6% for the contract between buyer so-and-so. So it only limits it to that transaction, the increase in compensation to that transaction. Does that make sense?
Eh,
So Maggie said, um,
not in a hateful way, Clark. You're so
No, I know.
patient and so good at explaining it. It just seems like a weird way to wrap our brains around it. And I know the forms change every, couple years or whatever. But like where I'm getting stuck is when people say, "Oh, I saw this house that popped up." I'm like, "Oh, do you want to see it?" And then so I'd be sending them the buyer's brokerage compensation agreement before taking them out to see a single house, correct?
Then the
No.
touring one.
The other one?
these are the these are the compensation agreements
Oh,
of how brokerages are going to get paid. You're referring to the buyer brokerage agreements. There are those 3 different forms. I see you shaking your head, so I see where
yes.
you made. I
Now
think you
I
made the
now I
connection.
know that I'm talking about the wrong subject. So now I understand. Sorry, guys.
And right now, it's never a wrong subject because they all intertwine together. So understanding how they work together becomes very important. Right now, our focus is the compensation agreement to say, which one do I use? Because I'm getting a lot of, when I'm running through your files, I'm getting a lot of pieces that give me concern that there's confusion, and I don't blame you. And because there are 2 forms, and we're trying to streamline it a little bit, but it's going to take about 2 to 3 months to streamline it for us, because there are still going to be listings out there that are seller's broker to buyer's broker, and there are still going to be brokerages that have not taken an initiative or have elected to use seller's broker to buyer's broker as the compensation method. And again, we're moving towards seller to buyer's broker for quite a few reasons. One would be in order to facilitate and demonstrate that we as a brokerage are attempting to abide by the guidelines or the intent of the Department of Justice, which is the decoupling of compensation. The seller to buyer's broker allows the money to flow in a way that is much more in line with what their complaint is. Second, if by chance a brokerage has a dispute or concern over the compensation that they received, and that would include us, their dispute would and should be with the seller, not with the listing brokerage.
That makes sense.
So in an attempt to protect our agents in our brokerage from potential liability or to minimize liability, we are moving towards seller to buyer's brokerage compensation so that the end person would contact the source rather than the middleman for a dispute.
Makes sense.
Okay, so that's why we're doing that type of thing.
Seller, a question, please, Clark?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, if I list a property for 6 months and I do the seller to buyer brokerage, after 2 months, my seller gets a little antsy because we're not getting a lot of showings. He goes, "Oh, I think we need to have the other." So I'll agree to pay the compensation. Can I switch that listing over or the compensation form over?
I think I missed something. Let me try and understand better.
Okay,
So you have a 6-month listing.
okay,
At the initiation of the 6-month listing, did the seller indicate that they had an intent to pay a buyer's brokerage?
yes,
Okay. And they said that at the onset of the listing, they would consider paying the buyer's brokerage 2.5%, correct?
oh, okay, all right. So we're gonna disclose that right up front then, okay. So if we do that, okay,
Well,
okay,
you
now
don't,
I'll, go ahead.
yeah, and here's, I'm sorry, I'm going to confuse the issue more. I just know it. But here's the deal. When we're listing a property, we need to focus on what the seller is paying you and the Legends of Real Estate. That's what we need to focus on.
Okay,
The separate discussion needs to be, will you consider paying a buyer's brokerage? Yes. Okay, great. Do you have an idea? No. What do you think? We have to have some discussion there. We have to be prepared to have discussion
Okay,
of,
okay,
and we need to be using whatever your words are. Here's what I'm recommending. Your intent, what you would consider as part of a negotiation, would you offer? What would you offer during a negotiation, do you believe? What would be your initial offer of compensation now? And then we edify that in the listing agreement under 10B.
okay.
Then we also fill out, to make our lives easier, and maybe it doesn't, then we fill out the seller to buyer's broker to the best of our knowledge. Our brokerage name, the address of the property, and the amount of compensation. Only 3 things you really have to fill out. Bingo, great.
And so when I get, and no one, all right, so I've had 5 offers on my new listing. 5
Okay.
offers. Not one has asked for what compensation is.
Did they include the compensation agreement when they made their offer?
No.
Okay.
They're investors.
Then they don't
What are you
care.
gonna do with it?
So there's no compensation.
No.
Wait,
I
so
thought
that
she
is
said
really, you got 5
months.
offers, Holly?
Already in 5 showings for today. It's on Woodward. And it's an investor.
OMG, congratulations. Well,
Well,
like,
it's not
but if they
sold.
don't, well, if they don't put anything in, then
Mm.
like, can you just like not say anything, right? And then say, we have multiple offers, if you want this, the buyer's gonna have to cough up whatever they want to pay their agent,
That's correct.
Yeah.
right?
The-
Holly, tell me how
so
it goes,
the-
okay? Good luck.
So to Maggie's point, to Holly's point, if the seller has said 0 compensation to the buyer's broker, and the agent working with the buyer doesn't submit a compensation agreement, then there is no compensation to the buyer's broker, and the buyer is intending on paying the buyer's broker themselves, which is exactly the purpose of a buyer brokerage agreement. I interrupted you, Ed.
Well, I thought she was asking was, after the listing, a 6-month listing is over,
Right.
and you're not
Is it
getting enough
over?
business, right?
Well, she said after 2
expired.
months, they
After
changed
2
their mind.
months.
She said after 2 months, they changed their mind.
Or
No, no,
change
well,
the
okay,
agreement.
okay, so I'm bringing a new scenario. Let's say your listing's up, almost up.
Okay.
And he says, maybe we should compensate more to get more activity.
Okay.
What form do you fill out? I guess the modification, right?
No,
To
you're
update.
no, because so Ed's point is okay, so we've got 2 scenarios on the table. Bonnie, I'm gonna need your help because I may have messed up on yours. So you had said you have a 6 months. After 2 months, did you say that the seller was changing their mind?
Yeah,
about the
yeah.
compens-
He wants more,
Okay,
yeah,
so
he wants more
at the
business,
end-
okay, yeah,
Okay, so at the end of 2 months, the seller decided, I don't want to offer 2.5 anymore. I want to offer 2 3/4.
correct.
Not a problem. You amend the listing agreement to reflect that 10B is increased from 2.5 to 2.75%, and you're good to go. And then you create a new compensation, seller to buyer's broker compensation agreement that reflects 2.75%. And when an agent calls you and asks what the compensation is or what the seller's intent is to compensate the buyer's broker, you can send over the seller to buyer's broker compensation agreement that reflects 2.75%. And you just and all you've filled in is the name of our brokerage, Legends of Real Estate, the address of the property, and the amount, which is now 2.75%. Does that make sense, Bonnie?
Yes, and I can call all those other agents and say, hey, seller is now willing to compensate the buyer's broker for 2.75 opposed to 2.5,
That's the
right?
seller. The seller's intent has now changed. Remember, it's their intent because an
Right.
offer could come in and they could just say, I want to go back to 2.5. They could, I mean, so they
Okay,
could,
fine.
they could shift. I mean, it's a term of negotiation. Ed brought up a discussion, an example. I have a 6-month listing agreement. The seller has been offering 2% and has not sold it. Maybe the price, maybe the location, but they've decided that it's the compensation. and they want to increase from 2% to 2.5% and relist the property, then you just do a modification to the listing agreement that would extend the expiration date and increase the compensation to the buyer's broker.
Thank you.
We have that one
No, we're talking about compensation
Yeah.
agreements, not listing
in?
agreements. But, and I think we're getting stuck on the modification. Remember, the modification to either of these forms, the modification to either compensation agreement is where the negotiation occurs on the compensation that the seller's broker or that the seller is offering to the buyer's broker. So if I make an offer, to any of your listings and I include a seller's broker to buyer's broker at 2.5%, and either one, the money isn't flowing through the seller's broker, or two, the 2.5% that I've requested, the seller doesn't want to pay to the seller's broker, then that's when the modification would be used. Same would be if I included a seller to buyer's broker and the money is flowing through the brokerage, then the seller would negate the seller to buyer's broker compensation and submit, either with their counteroffer or acceptance of current terms, a seller's broker to buyer's broker agreement. All right, so I think we've covered the scenario, a couple of the scenarios, where you need to use one form versus two forms. Okay. Are we all right? Concerned about y'all. Anyway, if you haven't
We
seen
are
it,
too.
this is the seller's broker to buyer's broker right at the top, slightly different. Again, if I'm filling this out, or if I have a listing with our brokerage that was before August 17th, then I would just fill in the seller's broker name, which is the Legends of Real Estate. I would just fill in the property address. I would leave the buyer's brokerage blank. I would leave the buyer's name blank, and I would just put the percentage down in the percentage down in the bottom portion of that. What was the other thing? Oh, I'm sorry. And then on that one also, and the other thing that I want to, well, let's finish just to make sure we're familiar with both. The seller to buyer's broker, the same thing. If the seller is paying directly to the buyer's broker, I would leave this, if I'm preparing this at the time of listing, I would leave the buyer's broker blank. I would put the seller's name in, I would put the property address, and down at the bottom, I would put the percentage that is the intent of the seller at the time of the listing.
When we would send this, does the seller we have to have his signature when we send it? No?
No.
Okay.
Good question. Do we have to have a signature on this? No. And if a brokerage says you have to, that is not accurate. You're sending in writing the intent of the seller at the time that they are requesting it.
It doesn't mean that has to be.
There is nothing that it can always change.
Right.
Compensation is negotiable. So there's no reason for the seller to sign that, because they can't commit to the 2.5%, 2.75%, 3% until they know what all the other terms and conditions are.
Mhm.
And we have a brokerage out there that's insisting that this be signed when you send it over. And we've had discussions with the lead broker going, it does not, because this is the intent. When you submit the offer and you go to contract, one of these forms has to be executed, because that's the only way someone's going to get paid.
Good.
So that's just the two of them. Couple of things. So let me go over some common questions that I've been getting. Well, before I go over these common questions, are there any specifics that we want to throw out onto the table? Here's what I'm going to tell you.
Clark, I have one quick question. So like,
Yeah, no.
you know, like if we're in a situation, I find myself in gray areas sometimes, right, in this business, and I want to do the right thing. I'm not afraid of looking bad in front of my customers. I want to be honest with them, and I'm not afraid of saying, oh, that's a good question. Let me double check with Clark and I'll get back on you, right? But like, what would be a situation that we could get in trouble with another agent on the other side?
Anything.
There's so many. There's so
Right,
Anything.
yeah, right now, I think that's a loaded question. What I think here's what I'm hoping by us having these discussions is that we'll set the standard. Here's what I'm gonna tell you. You are all fantastic at helping people buy and helping people sell. That's what you do.
Mhm.
If you have any questions, if you're concerned about any of the paperwork, let me help you with that. You focus on the relationship with your buyers, the relationship with your sellers. I'll help you fill it out correctly. I'll help tell you what you need, what paperwork. The thing I'm going to have to ask you to do is to give grace and take a breath. Because if I can't answer the phone right away, or if I can't answer the text right away, it doesn't mean I'm ignoring you. I promise. But Maggie, how can we get in trouble with other agents? We can get in trouble with other agents. Like, for example, if an agent says, how come this isn't signed? And you say, well, I'm just sharing with you the current intent of the seller. And they say, well, you have to have it signed. And then we break off into, no, I don't, you Viking idiot. That's when we might get into trouble with some of the other, it's blame me. I mean, you don't even have to say the legend. You can just say, look, Clark told me that I don't have to have it signed unless he tells me different. I'm not getting it signed until you submit your offer. If you would like to call him, call him.
Yes, that's very good.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's
If-
the
if-
line I needed, Clark. Thank you.
You are going to be so sorry, Clark.
That's all right. Make me the bad guy. I'm happy. Believe me, I have read this stuff up, one, downside, and I'm happy to discuss what's required versus what's needed versus what we're doing versus what other brokerages are doing with someone else. I'm happy to.
And it's gonna be this way for 3 or 4 months.
Mhm.
It'll just be this
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
But be kind. The main thing is say, look, we're working through this all together. It's all new for all of us.
Yeah.
But this is what we've been trained to do.
And
We can
I think that's great because many of the other brokerages have not spent time like you have
Right. they
to
get
ask
to
the
you, yeah.
questions, to spend the time sitting with all of us. So, I mean, this is what we've been sharing. This is what we've been asked to do. So,
Cool.
so let's go through a couple common questions. Does a compensation agreement have to be signed? No, it does not have to be signed prior to an executed contract. Prior to an executed contract, remember, the only commitment to pay is an executed compensation agreement with an executed contract. Okay. So prior to execution, no. If someone asks you, you want to send it, no problem. Can a listing agent confirm the seller's intent to pay the buyer's compensation in any other way? Yes. So if I'm working with, if I'm out on the road and an buyer's agent calls me and says, is the seller on 123 Main Street willing to offer buyer brokerage compensation? You say, yes, they are. And they say, well, how much? And you say, well, their intent, and please try to remember this. This is the seller's intent at this moment in time, right?
Mhm.
So the seller's intent is currently 2.5%. Can you send me the compensation agreement? I'm sorry, I'm out on the road. Let me go ahead and text that to you. We all know that in writing is much stronger, that verbal is only as good as the paper that it's written on. So don't be afraid to send it to them text. If you can shoot them a quick email, that's fine too. If they're arguing with you, say, I'm sorry, this isn't good enough. This is what I have now. When I can get to my computer, I will send you a compensation agreement, but please feel free to use this to fill out a seller to buyer brokerage compensation agreement with your offer. Maybe we need to start directing some of them, you know?
Well,
Should the compensation agreement be written into the contract? Oof. Yes and no. So yes, if the compensation agreement is the seller to buyer broker. Remember, the contract is between the buyer and the seller. So any compensation that does not flow through one of those two parties should not be in that agreement. So, and this is the other reason that we are leaning towards seller to buyer's broker, because we want it edified in an additional document. So if it is seller's broker to buyer's broker, which is the way that we're going to be going, then you would put it into other terms and conditions, or where all those riders are. So the additional terms, or the one just before it, paragraph 19 or paragraph 20 in the purchase and sale agreement, you would write in their compensation agreement, seller to buyer's broker, or you can just write in compensation agreement. That lets everybody know that a compensation agreement should accompany the contract. If it is the seller's broker to buyer's broker, it cannot be in the purchase and sale agreement. This is money flowing brokerage to brokerage. It does not engage the buyer or the seller. It is the listing brokerage's obligation to collect the money from the seller and pay the buyer's brokerage.
Okay.
This could be a violation of Article 16 of our Code of Ethics. Therefore, if it is the seller's broker to buyer's broker, it should not be in the purchase and sale agreement.
mhm.
Everybody see that distinction there?
Yes, same
Again,
as it
it's
was
the way the money
before.
flows.
Same as it was
Excuse me?
before. Same as it was before.
Right,
No way
but
with-
does that, but we, keep going?
Nope, okay? I'll shut up.
Yeah, okay. But we still need that executed seller's broker to buyer's broker, if that's the way the money's gonna be flowed. It's the only way that we can share how we are being paid, right?
They can't be in there, but it has to be attached, it has to be.
Given to the
agreement.
title company.
Oh, to the title company.
Yeah, remember, it's not anything to do with the buyer and the seller.
Okay, so it goes to the,
The seller's broker to buyer's broker only goes to the title company.
ah,
And even the agreement doesn't necessarily have to go with the title company, they just need to know.
wow.
But I mean, it's in everybody's best interest to have an executed document that shows that both brokerages have agreed that the money will flow from the listing brokerage to the buyer's brokerage, or from the seller's brokerage to the buyer's brokerage. Yes. What should the term of the compensation agreement be? I have seen a lot of compensation agreements that want to match the term of the compensation agreement to the term of the listing. So I've seen 90 days, 180 days, 120 days. No, the compensation agreement is solely the term, the term of the compensation agreement is solely the term of the time that you've sent this over. We're recommending 7 to 15 days. The default is 30 days. This is just, I'm sending Holly a compensation agreement that says right now, this is the seller's intent. I don't want to commit the seller to more. The seller probably doesn't want me to commit them to more than 7 or 15 days. If we can't get under contract, and remember, the contract is the ultimate edifier. So if I send over a compensation agreement to Holly at 2.5% and put 120 days on it, now when Holly goes back and writes an offer in 60 days because the house possibly still is not sold, or her buyers went to another property that fell through, so now they're coming back to this property, she can hold me to 2.5% if it was signed, and the seller may have adjusted to 2%.
Okay.
So the shorter the time period, the better. Why? Well, once it's executed and there's an executed contract,
That's it.
it moves forward with everything, right? Just like a listing agreement, if you're under contract at the time of the expiration, the listing still holds true.
Right.
This is the same thing. If we've executed this and gone under contract, the terms still hold true. So it's okay. So the shorter the time period, probably the better. Maximum 30 days, we're recommending 7 to 15. If you aren't going to get under contract in 7 to 15 days, you may not be getting under contract. And don't hold anybody to something that may not be true a week from now, 2 weeks, 3 weeks from now, right? Let's see what else. Should dispute resolution always be initial? Absolutely. This is the best way to collect compensation if there's a problem. So please always execute initial the dispute resolution section of the agreement, the compensation agreement. Can the compensation agreement be modified? Absolutely. Ed brought it up. There's a modification to everything these days. So if we're negotiating, you don't have to re-execute a compensation agreement. If I submit a seller to buyer's broker compensation agreement at 3% to the seller, and the seller wants to reduce that to 2.5% and still pay $6,000 in concessions, that's how they would do it. They would modify the seller to buyer's broker compensation agreement to 2.5%, change concessions from 8,000 to 6,000, or from 4,000 to 6,000, and whatever other terms and conditions, time for closing, whatever, and that would all go back. That's a counteroffer. It's a counteroffer. Just got a couple more forms now. So we get the compensation agreement, the modification, counteroffer, and I'm sorry, let's not forget the original offer. Send that too. Do I need to get compensation agreement for every property I show? No, you don't. You don't need to get a compensation agreement for any property you show, because you should have a buyer brokerage agreement for every property that you show. If it's a showing agreement, and let's just, I've got buyer brokerage revisiting the 27th. But remember, there are 3: property pre-touring agreement, and you guys read that, because the very first line says you're under no obligation to pay me anything at this time. That agreement puts you at huge opportunity not to get paid.
What's the
Ever.
agreement showing?
The property pre-touring agreement. So, and you'll notice there's no modification to the property pre-touring agreement, because, and that's why that should just be, I'm running out to show you a property real quick. I don't know you. I don't know who you are. I just want to get in front of you, or you want to get in front of me. You want to get in this house, and I want to see if this is going to work. But that is only good. That should not be good for more than a week. That should not be good for more than a week. And you need to transition to either a showing agreement, you need to kick them to the curb, or transfer to a showing agreement or an exclusive buyer brokerage agreement.
How about if you're showing a rental?
Same difference.
Same form?
You can use the property pre-touring agreement to let them know. If they're like, I'm not signing anything, I would say, well, look, this doesn't obligate you to pay anything. It just allows me to be
Open
in
the door
line.
for you.
Yeah, to open the door for you. That's great. I love it. This just allows me to open the door for you.
Because I got my neighbor wants me to show some rentals, so he can rent it while he fixes his house up for me to list.
Okay, that's great. But before you show property, you need him or her to sign
To rent
something.
it.
And if it's a property pre-touring agreement, I don't recommend those, because the teeth in it are very dull, and you run the risk of not getting paid. So if you already know this person, then I would say you need to be starting with a showing agreement, which identifies the properties you're going to show, or an exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, which says anything I show you, I deserve to get paid on.
I figured that.
Will the Legends be creating a website that shows compensation being offered on a listing? Many of you have probably seen the website that Caldwell Banker created, that shows each of their properties and the compensation that they're offering on that.
That defeats the whole purpose.
No, because the agreement says you can show compensation on your own properties on your website. So what they did was create a website specific for their properties that shows the compensation. We are not doing that. We feel first of all, compensation is always negotiable. Second, anything that would allow an agent to view and review compensation to potentially eliminate properties is completely,
Yeah.
is not in alignment with what the settlement and the intended. And then we'll just have I mean, you guys, there's already seven, and this isn't a made up number. There are already 17 other lawsuits out there now. So this is going to go on for a while.
And tell about the testers that are out.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Holly. Their testers are already out. They're calling to see, are you getting a buyer brokerage agreement signed before you show them a house? Not, let's go see it, and then we'll create the buyer brokerage agreement. Not, you guys, please don't do that.
You can meet them like at the coffee shop and let them sign it and then go to the house and that type of thing,
You can meet them at the house and they can sign at the house, but before they enter that property,
just before they go.
I mean, whether it's on the hood of your car, the trunk of your car, whatever, on their back, on your back, they need to sign saying, before they enter that house, look, here's how this works. They have to sign that. You guys, testers are out there, they're making phone calls or trying to set appointments. We've all done it. We have all done it. Please don't say you haven't. We have all done it. I'd like to see a property. Great, let's meet there. I've got 15 minutes. I'll meet you there in 10. We've all done it.
Mhm.
We can't do that anymore. If you want to see your name at the end of a lawsuit that says versus Clark LeBlond or versus Ollie McMurray, then you go ahead. But I'm not looking forward to, I don't want my name at the end of anything that says versus. So we're trying to do the best we can to keep everybody protected. Anyway, these are some of the common questions. What other questions have you been experiencing? What other things have you been experiencing that are raising questions so that we can make sure that those get on the table for you?
Well, I'll give you an example of
Great.
one of the telephone calls I got from the investors yesterday. Said, we don't have anybody representing us and you can do it. And I said, no. I said, there's no compensation offered. You need to have someone in your office do it. Because I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to be in that position.
I think it's great. And the other thing that you could have done is have them sign a non-rep form, and then basically all you're doing is opening the door for them. Or you can open the door for them and say, please go through, have a good time. I will be out here. I cannot answer any questions for you. I don't represent you. I represent the seller.
Well, they don't even go,
Of course,
They
I
don't
know.
even go to look at house.
Anyway,
Mhm.
so good point.
Mhm.
And a lot of us have forgotten about the no brokerage relationship.
Yeah,
Form.
I didn't even thought about it.
Yeah. And I don't know that it's necessary, as long as you're clear that if you open that door, you're not representing them, you should be fine. But the minute because the testers will, okay, thank you very much. You know what? This seems like a really good house. What do you think? What do you think a lender would be charging on something like this? What kind of a rate do you think would be good? Do you think the seller would be willing to? It seems like it might have some condition issues. Do you think the seller would be willing to offer some concessions? I don't know. You
Right?
need to get your agent, or you need to get an agent to write it up. If you're asking to employ me, I'm happy to interview, or I'll meet you to discuss what I can do for you. But at this time, I'm working for the seller.
Mhm.
You guys watch it. We'll come in the phone call. And as sure as we'd say, I would love to show you that property. Why don't we meet there? That's already strike one, because we didn't say anything about, are you currently working with another realtor? Have you signed anything with another realtor? Are you any of that kind of stuff? Yes, Karen.
I'm sorry. Can you address open houses and what forms we need to use with people walking in?
Sure. Open houses, you need no forms. You need
Okay.
absolutely no form for open house. You are there representing the seller. Welcome your guests. I don't think it's a bad thing to have a questionnaire. I don't think it's a bad thing to have a sign-in log. I don't think it's a bad thing to say, have you signed anything with another realtor if they start asking you questions? The minute they start asking you questions about the property and and this is where we have to blow our minds out a little bit. We have always looked at working with as I have a hot customer and we are looking for property. We have to blow our minds out a little bit because the definition is now, are you discussing properties? Are you sharing properties? Are you answering specific questions about properties, about lending, about once that's now working with someone. And if they haven't signed an agreement with another agent, then they need to sign one with you. Again, at your open house, maybe you just have the property pre-touring agreement, have them sign that, say, great, let me answer a few more detailed questions for you, but before we really get into this much deeper, I would like to meet with you to share how I manage the process with a buyer and share the value that I bring to determine whether we really want to work together. But at minimum, I would say the property pre-touring agreement is the only thing you would need, but that's if they start asking you specific questions. And believe me, if they start asking you, I mean, we've all had it. People, this is kind of cool, but I don't really know. Tell me a little bit more about.
Right.
So we're not a transaction broker anymore?
We are. This has nothing to do with agency. It's nothing to do with
I
agency.
mean, it does, transaction agent.
None of this has anything to do with agency. Our company continues to be a transaction brokerage.
So question, so you're doing the open house and you are there to represent the seller and provide the house in the best possible condition and the things that are unique to that property that buyer may like washer dryer stays, here's the washroom, notice the gas stove, the things that we say that we know of as the listing agent. Does that come across as providing information to the buyer? You see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. So does highlighting the features of the home begin to verge on working with?
That's correct.
No, it does not.
Okay.
Here's what I would recommend. I would recommend a special feature sheet,
Right.
a flyer, give them both, and let them move through the home. If they have questions about those things, yes, absolutely, the washer and dryer stays. They don't read it fully, or oh, I noticed in the bedroom there was this. It looks like it's attached. Is it? Yes, that is attached. That will stay, no problem. But a feature sheet or something that highlights the benefits of the home, and then I don't think that's a bad time to follow it up with.
Are you working with an agent?
I love the fact that you might be interested in this home. Is there a chance you're working with someone or have signed an agreement? And I think we have to change it from working with, which is what our mindset, anybody more than a week and a half. Are you represented by, have you signed an agreement with another agent? I want to respect their relationship with you. So I think that's fine. You were going to ask a question.
Could you call that like a representative agreement? If you signed a representative agreement with them?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, this goes to show that we know, but buyers out there are in the dark on how this goes.
Yeah.
So it's a learning. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah. And I think that's where we're going to get most of our questions are, from those buyers. It's like, well, have I signed anything? I don't think I did. I'm not really sure. Okay. I completely understand. What I'd like to do is give you this flyer and this thing. And if you have questions, I would be happy to meet you for a buyer consult and discuss whether we might like working together. If you find that you didn't sign something, there's different ways to capture them if they're not sure. But we have to try to be sure as best as possible, because otherwise it's like going behind the sign. But online, guys, any scenarios, questions you're considering or thinking or curious about, or?
Yeah, I did have one quick question, because I was listening to you discuss the listing agreement. And so when we select compensation in the listing agreement, we also need to provide the compensation sheets with the listing agreement that are not signed, but then added into the listing in the Flex MLS? Yes, no?
You would never put the compensation agreement in MLS. There should be nothing related to compensation in MLS.
Okay, so not in the
The,
document section.
you did, correct. You would never put
Okay.
anything in the documents related
Okay.
to compensation. This includes, and you bring up a really great point of clarification. We have had agents putting into the seller's property disclosure 3% compensation to buyer's brokerage, 2% compensation to buyer's brokerage, right? And then putting that in MLS.
Yeah.
Can't do it. Can't do it.
Where would there be a place to put that?
Just write it on there.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's the only way you could do it is
Yeah.
write it in.
Right.
It'd be kind
How
of like
stupid.
sending the title company a bill for the roof, sending the compensation,
Right.
right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, it can't be in there. So that's a good point, Jessica. You can't add compensation to a seller's property disclosure or have anything related to compensation in documents in MLS.
So the,
Regarding the compensation agreement at the time of listing, you
okay,
do not have to send that. You do not have to send that to the seller to sign. The
Okay.
point is we've included it in the listing packages so that you have it available to fill out in once you've gone through the listing appointment and established what compensation will be, one, to us as the listing brokerage, and two, the potential or intent of amount to be offered to the buyer's brokerage. You would then edify that in a compensation agreement that you would have available to hopefully make your life easier, that you can just quickly send through app files to an agent asking for confirmation of what the seller's intent is at that time.
okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anything else?
Looking good.
All right. How we doing? Okay, I can give you a half an hour of your time back if you'd like. There were a couple of ones that we had run through. So an agent calls to find out if the seller is offering buyer brokerage compensation. They are. You can send them a compensation agreement. You could text it to them. You could email it to them. If they insist on a compensation agreement, just let them know you'll do it as quickly as you can when you get back to your computer. If you keep a picture of it on your phone and you want to send it to them via text, you can do that also. Does it have to be signed? Remember, it does not have to be signed. You call a listing agent to find out if the seller is offering buyer's broker compensation. They don't answer, but the buyer is ready to write an offer. Attach the seller to buyer broker compensation agreement with your offer. They'll let you know if it's not the right one. They'll let you know if they're willing to compensate. It's a term or condition that the buyer is asking in an offer. So you're good, no problem. And this is the one that we went through kind of as a group. If the buyer brokerage agreement is at 3%, but the seller to seller's broker to buyer's broker is at 2.5%, then you would need both the seller's broker to buyer's broker at 2.5% and the seller to buyer broker at 0.5%, because the buyer is asking for additional compensation directly from the seller to their brokerage.
Clark,
Yes,
do
ma'am.
are builders under the same guidelines as sellers, ordinary sellers?
Yeah, builders are considered under the same guidelines of this agreement. So,
Thank you.
but they're refusing to sign compensation agreements. So they're saying that when you execute, which is fine, they can say that. They're saying that when you, and this is a few that we've experienced right now. Nocatee is kind of broken up. There's no long, they're not, you don't have, if you go to the main new home section, what's that called? Whatever that, where you go and there's all the builders are there. No, the welcome center. You go there and they used to be able to tell you, well, this brokerage offering this, or excuse me, this builder's offering this builder's offering that. This builder's offering, they're not doing that anymore. You have to go directly to the builder, and then the builder will tell you what they're offering at that time. They do offer Bonuses. How do we manage bonuses in a buyer broker compensation? You can write in at the onset of a buyer brokerage agreement that the buyer will allow the brokerage to collect a bonus up to a certain amount of money, or you can amend the buyer brokerage agreement once the buyer selects their builder. Please note that compensation is always negotiable. So at the onset of a buyer brokerage agreement, if you write something like that into it, like for example, let's say I wrote, that they're going to pay me, the buyer's going to pay the buyer brokerage 3%, and I write into the additional terms that they allow the buyer brokerage to collect up to $10,000 in a bonus. And now we go to a builder, and the builder is offering, the $5,000 bonus, so I'm covered. The buyer can then say to me, I didn't think about this, but can't I get a part of that too?
Mhm.
Then it's negotiable again. So you would have to negotiate with the buyer to say, absolutely, let's figure out that you could stand hard and say, hey, you gave me the permission to get an additional $5,000. And the buyer can say, well, that was before I realized, that we're going for this price of a house, or upgrades are costing me this much, or so
Wow.
I'll let you collect the 5,000, but only if you give me. Well, let's see, is Delilah out there? No.
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Is it
I'm
okay
here.
to share your listing experience?
Sure.
She interviewed for a listing. Lady loved her naturally and said she would be willing to list with her, but is interested in new construction in a 55 plus community and would only list with her if she agreed to give her 50% of the compensation from the builder. Otherwise she wouldn't list with her. She would go direct on the other side.
So what'd she do?
Delilah made the decision to go ahead and
do it.
do it.
Something of something is better than something of nothing.
Half a glass of water.
Well, and
Right.
I mean, more than that, I think that she felt like it was a good listing.
Right.
And the other part of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Delilah, and the other part of it is this woman knows other people in her
Mhm.
community, and Delilah will do a good job. So there's the opportunity for potential referrals. Plus, going up there, she can, to the new construction facility, she can create a relationship with another individual at the on-site, and there might be somebody who needs representation when they come in to buy.
Exactly.
So I think she did a very smart business decision,
Mhm.
opening up her opportunities,
Yes.
and not to mention that she just had a birthday.
It's called cost of doing business.
Yeah, CDV.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But so I think we're going to have to be astute and this is something that we're not good at. We are not good at being the CEO of our business. We are not good at that. We have to be the CEO of our business and make wise business decisions, make educated business decisions. But in order to do that, we have to educate the person across the table from us.
Wow.
Thanks, you guys. Okay, anybody else? All right. Well, you guys are fantastic. I appreciate everything. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, I think. Maybe.
Thank you.
And stop the share. And if anybody has anything, oops, I see something that came up in the chat I may have missed. Oh, Nick, thanks you guys. All right, so if nobody has anything else, I'm going to go ahead and kind of call it. And if you have a specific example or suggestion, or please, I'm writing things right, left, and center, and trying to keep us all aware of changes as we find them. So if you have suggestions, we are so open to that. And we want to protect you, protect us, and protect your customers also. So
Amen.
Thank you, Clark.
If there's nothing else, I'm gonna let us all go and give you back 15 or 20 minutes of your life.
I'm going to the dentist.
Take care, you guys. Have a great day.